Before you immerse yourself in tonight's terror, hit that subscribe button if you think you can handle even darker stories lurking in the shadows. The emergency alert hit out of nowhere. It wasn't like the usual amber warnings they'd gotten in the past, the ones about weather or power outages. This one was different, the kind that makes your stomach drop the second you read it. Victor Hayes had been sitting in his living room, his wife Rachel and son Noah beside him, when their phones buzzed all at once. He glanced down at the screen, and there it was, in all caps. Stay inside. Avoid contact. Lock all doors. For a second, the room went quiet. Rachel looked at him, her brow furrowed. Noah, who had been playing with his toys on the floor, stopped and looked up, his face scrunching in confusion. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, voice small. Victor didn't answer right away. He reached for the remote and flicked the TV on. The anchor's voice crackled through the speakers, her words coming out faster than usual, like she was trying to hold it together. "Reports are coming in of a violent outbreak. Symptoms include aggression, disorientation, and cannibalistic behavior." The words sounded almost unreal, like something out of a movie, but Victor could tell by the look on Rachel's face, by the way she was already moving to the window, that this was very real. He stood and joined her at the window, trying not to let the anxiety creep in. It was dark outside, and the neighborhood was still. Too still. A few houses down, Mr. Lawrence, the neighbor, stood in his driveway. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural. At first, it looked like he was waiting for something, but then Victor saw it, the way he was staring, not at anything, just into space. Rachel let out a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" Before Victor could answer, he heard the sound of footsteps. Not normal footsteps, though. These were slow, dragging, heavy, and they were coming from the other houses. Rachel pulled the curtain back a little more, and as more figures started to stagger out of their homes, Victor knew they weren't just confused. They were something else entirely. He didn't have to see much more to understand that something had gone horribly wrong. A scream echoed from down the street, sharp and panicked. Victor's hand tightened around the remote, and as if on cue, the power went out. The house was thrown into darkness, and the only light that remained came from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows across the yard. Rachel didn't waste any time. She grabbed Noah's hand and turned to Victor. "We need to go." Victor quickly grabbed a bag from the closet and started throwing in anything he thought might be useful: water, snacks, a flashlight. He grabbed the baseball bat from the corner of the living room and handed it to Rachel. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. Noah clung to Rachel, looking up at his parents with wide eyes. "Dad, what's happening?" Victor didn't have a good answer. He didn't know, but there was no time to explain. The first bang on the window came just as they were heading for the back door. A loud thud, followed by a low growl that didn't sound human. Victor froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Go!" he hissed, pulling Rachel and Noah toward the back door. The door creaked loudly as he opened it, and the three of them stepped into the backyard, the night air chilly against their skin. They moved quickly but quietly. The house they had called home for years suddenly felt like a trap, and every step they took felt too loud. Victor kept his eyes on their surroundings, scanning the shadows, trying to make sure they weren't being followed. Noah's grip on Rachel tightened. He didn't say anything, but Victor could feel the fear radiating off him. The Hayes family moved as quietly as they could, the night air thick with tension. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. The infected were out there, and each one was a threat. Every time the wind rustled, every time a branch snapped, Victor's heart skipped a beat. It was like the world had changed overnight, and the rules had shifted. Victor held Noah's hand tightly, making sure to keep him close. Rachel walked ahead, her eyes darting back and forth, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They had barely made it out of their backyard when a noise broke the silence. The unmistakable sound of a trash can tipping over, followed by a faint clatter as something inside rattled to the ground. Victor's body went rigid. They had to stop. He turned to Rachel, his voice low but urgent. "Stay still." She didn't need to be told twice. They all froze, holding their breath. The alley was dark, the only light coming from distant street lamps. But even in that dim light, Victor could make out a figure moving toward them, slow, jerky, like it was struggling to keep its balance. As the figure came closer, Victor's stomach dropped. It was Mrs. Carter, his son's teacher. She'd been kind, always making Noah laugh with those quirky jokes of hers. But now her face was twisted with something dark. Her clothes were torn, stained with what could only be blood. Her eyes, those eyes that had once been warm and friendly, were now vacant, clouded with something Victor couldn't even begin to understand. For a moment, there was a flicker, like a brief recognition. Mrs. Carter stopped in her tracks, her head tilting as she stared at them. Victor's breath hitched as he wondered if for a second she was seeing them as they were, just people, not threats. He thought maybe, just maybe, there was still something of her left. But then, that moment was gone. With a horrifying screech, Mrs. Carter lunged. It was like she was no longer human, just a force of pure rage. Victor didn't even think. He swung the baseball bat with everything he had, the sound of it connecting with her body sickening in the stillness of the alley. She crumpled to the ground with a thud, twitching for a brief second before falling still. Noah gasped, burying his face in Rachel's side. His small body trembled, his hands clutching her tightly like a lifeline. Victor stood over Mrs. Carter's still form, his chest heaving. He didn't want to think about what he had just done. He couldn't. All he could focus on was getting his family out of there. "Let's go," Victor whispered, his voice tight. Rachel didn't say anything, but she nodded and gently pulled Noah away from her, guiding him forward. They had to keep moving, had to get as far as possible from the neighborhood that had been their home. The streets were empty now, but not quiet. In the distance, they could hear the occasional scream, a reminder that they weren't alone, not in any sense of the word. The group's nerves were on edge as they crept through the dark streets. They had been walking for felt like hours, and just when they thought they couldn't go much further, they spotted the grocery store. The flickering light from inside was a welcome sign, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise endless, empty night. Victor was the first to approach, his instincts telling him to check before rushing in. The doors were ajar, just wide enough for them to slip through. He motioned for Rachel and Noah to follow, then pushed the door open slowly. Inside, it was eerily quiet. Shelves that were once stocked with food now stood half empty, some items discarded on the floor as if people had left in a hurry. In the far corner, a group of survivors was scavenging, picking through cans and boxes, looking for whatever they could find. Victor noticed Mark right away. Mark had been a police officer before everything fell apart, and he looked the part now, even if his uniform was long gone. He was scanning the aisles with a wary eye, his hand resting on the grip of a handgun at his side. Beside him, Sarah, a college student, was nervously sorting through some supplies. Victor exchanged a look with Rachel, silently asking if they should approach. Rachel nodded, her eyes wary but relieved to see other people. They needed help, and this could be their chance. As they moved closer, Mark's sharp gaze landed on them. He didn't lower his gun but nodded in acknowledgement. "You're lucky," he said gruffly. "This place is about as safe as it gets right now." Victor gave him a tight smile. "We're just passing through." Noah's feverish face caught Sarah's attention. She stepped closer, her brow furrowing. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Before Victor could respond, David, another survivor who had been rummaging through a nearby shelf, turned around sharply. His eyes locked on Noah, then widened with suspicion. He took a step forward. "He's got a fever," he said, his voice low but urgent. "That's one of the symptoms. He's infected." Rachel snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "He's just scared, okay? It's from the stress, not the infection." But David didn't seem convinced. "You're just saying that to protect him, but we can't risk it." His eyes stayed locked on Noah, as if searching for any sign of the infection. Victor stepped in, trying to keep the peace. "We're not here to cause problems," he said, keeping his tone as calm as he could. "Just let us stay for a while. We won't be any trouble." David's gaze flickered between them, but before he could respond, a guttural growl echoed from outside the store. The infected. They were getting closer, and it seemed like they'd been drawn in by the noise. Mark's hand tightened on his gun, and Sarah grabbed a crowbar from one of the shelves. "We need to move, now." The group scrambled into action, but the tension in the air was palpable. David was still eyeing Noah, his suspicion turning into something darker. But there was no time to argue. The first infected figure staggered through the door, its eyes glazed and wild. It was followed by another, then another. The store quickly became a chaotic scene of shouts and frenzied movement. Victor swung his bat, connecting with the first infected's head with a sickening thud. Mark fired his pistol, taking down 2 more with quick, precise shots. Sarah swung the crowbar, knocking one of the creatures back, but the sound of gunfire only seemed to attract more of them. The store quickly became a battleground. Victor could hear Rachel shouting for Noah to stay close, her voice sharp with fear. He fought with everything he had, his bat becoming heavier with every swing, but he couldn't stop them all. They were outnumbered. "No! Get back!" Mark shouted, firing another shot, but the group was being pushed back inch by inch as the infected closed in on them. Victor's heart raced as he fought to protect his family. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. The survivors had already taken a few hits, and the infected kept coming. In the chaos, David lunged at Noah, trying to grab him. "Get away from my son!" Rachel screamed, her voice raw with panic. She shoved David away, but in that moment, everything went wrong. One of the infected grabbed Sarah from behind, pulling her into the throng. Her screams were cut short, and Victor felt a sharp pang of regret. The group was losing ground fast. The doorways were blocked, and escape seemed impossible. Mark's voice was low but commanding as he yelled, "We need to move, now." They fought their way toward the back exit, pushing through the store with everything they had. Victor could feel his energy draining, but he kept moving, determined to get his family out of there alive. They barely made it, slipping through the back door just as the infected swarmed the front. The door slammed shut behind them, but the sense of safety was short-lived. The chaos of the grocery store was still fresh in their minds. They'd escaped with their lives, but at a cost. Sarah was gone, and David, well, he wasn't the same anymore. The tension between him and the group had only grown since the attack, and it was clear things wouldn't ever be the same. Victor's mind raced as they stumbled into the night, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on his shoulders. The decision to head for the city's evacuation point had been an uneasy one. The group knew it was their best chance, but the road ahead was uncertain, and the risks were high. They had heard rumors of a safe zone, a place where military personnel were supposedly gathering survivors, but it felt like a distant hope in a world that had grown darker with every passing hour. The highway stretched out before them, a twisted reminder of what had been. Abandoned cars lined both sides of the road, their once pristine windshields now cracked, their doors ajar as if the occupants had fled in a panic. Tires were flattened, glass shards glittered in the street like forgotten fragments of a broken world. Victor's mind was clouded with thoughts of Rachel and Noah. He couldn't stop moving forward, couldn't stop pushing them toward the hope that maybe, just maybe, this evacuation point would be their salvation. As they walked, the silence was oppressive. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But then, a faint cry reached their ears, carried by the wind. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He motioned for the group to stop. They stood there, listening intently. The sobs grew louder, more frantic. "Over there," Mark whispered, pointing toward an SUV parked on the side of the road. The vehicle's hazard lights blinked erratically, casting an eerie glow on the highway. Victor's instincts told him to keep moving, to stay alert. But curiosity, no, maybe it was compassion, pulled him toward the SUV. As they approached, they saw her, a woman, clutching the steering wheel with trembling hands, her face streaked with tears. She looked like someone who had lost everything, but somehow still clung to the smallest glimmer of hope. The man beside her, however, was not the same. His eyes were vacant, his skin a sickly shade of pale. He was breathing erratically, his chest heaving in unnatural ways. The infection had taken hold of him completely. "I can't leave him," the woman sobbed, her voice breaking as she pleaded with the group. "Please, you have to help us. We just need to get out of here." Mark stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Ma'am, your husband is infected. You can't stay here. The infected are everywhere, and you're only putting yourself at risk by staying." She shook her head violently, her hands gripping the door handle, as if she could somehow keep the world from collapsing around her. No, I can't. I promised him. I promised I would never leave him. Victor felt a knot form in his stomach. There was nothing they could do. They had seen this before. People who couldn't face the truth, who refused to let go of the ones they loved, even when it meant their own lives would be the cost. Mark's voice softened, but his eyes were hard. I know you want to help him, but staying here won't save him. It's over for him. If you stay, it'll be over for both of you. The woman's sobs grew louder, more desperate. Please, she begged. Please don't leave us. Victor's heart ached, but he knew there was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to stay here, not with the infected closing in, drawn by the sound of her cries. He grabbed Noah's hand and tugged him toward the other side of the highway, trying to shield him from the scene unfolding behind them. Mark didn't hesitate. He stayed behind, his back to the group, his gaze fixed on the woman and her husband. He was trying to reason with her, trying to make her understand, but it was too late. The infected were already too close. Victor turned to Rachel, his voice low. We need to go. Now. Rachel nodded, her face pale with fear. She didn't need to be told twice. They turned and started running, the sound of frantic footsteps echoing in their ears. Behind them, the woman's voice shattered the quiet once more. Please, don't leave us. Don't. Her voice was drowned out by the guttural growls of the infected, their snarls growing louder by the second. Victor didn't look back. He couldn't. The highway had become a killing field, and they were just one more group of survivors trying to escape. As they ran, the screams behind them faded, swallowed by the relentless growls of the infected. The noise was replaced by the sound of their own footsteps, heavy with the weight of what they had just left behind. Victor's chest burned, his legs aching with the effort, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to their goal. But even as they pushed forward, the harsh reality of their situation settled over him. The highway wasn't a safe route. It was a death trap, a path of destruction that they were all too familiar with. They didn't know if they were walking toward salvation or into a new kind of hell, but they kept moving because it was all they could do. The farmhouse was a breath of fresh air after the chaos of the road. It stood on a hill, surrounded by fields that had long since stopped growing anything of value. The house itself was old, weathered, but surprisingly intact. The walls creaked with the wind, and the scent of dust and old wood filled the air, but for a fleeting moment it felt like a home, something that had been lost for so long. Joel, the man who owned the place, was a big guy, broad shoulders and a weathered face that seemed to reflect the years of hard work he'd put in here. His teenage daughter, Hannah, was a quiet, nervous presence beside him, her eyes flicking between the group as if trying to make sense of who they were, what they wanted. Still, she offered them a faint, hesitant smile when they arrived. It was as if they were all trying to convince themselves that maybe, just maybe, they could trust each other. The house had a wood-burning stove, and after some quick introductions, Joel got a fire going. The warmth spread through the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Victor could almost relax. Noah, exhausted from the day's events, immediately found a corner and curled up with a blanket, his tired eyes heavy with the weight of everything he'd seen. Rachel, though, wasn't doing as well. When Victor took her aside that night, he could see the strain in her face, the way her eyes had lost their usual spark. The scratch on her arm, the one she'd gotten during the ambush at the grocery store, had been small at first, hardly noticeable. But over the past few hours, it had begun to swell, turning a deep, angry red. Her skin was hot to the touch, and the fever that had set in was only getting worse. "Victor," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she held his gaze. "If I turn, promise me you'll protect Noah. Don't let him see." Her words were like a punch in the gut. He felt his heart tighten, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had always tried to protect her, to keep their family safe, but hearing her say those words, knowing what it meant, made him feel helpless. It was the first time the reality of the infection hit him so hard, so close to home. He held her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the pulse beneath her fingers, and nodded. There was no hesitation in his response, even though it felt like a lie in his chest. "I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll protect him. I'll protect both of you." Rachel gave him a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as she tried to steady her breathing. "I don't want him to see. I don't want him to have to remember me like that," she whispered, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as she was convincing him. Victor didn't know how to respond. What could he say? The thought of losing her, of Noah losing his mother, was unbearable. But he couldn't let himself fall apart. Not yet. He squeezed her hand again, trying to hold on to the moment before everything changed. "I know," he said softly. "I know." But deep down, he didn't. He didn't know how he would protect Noah from the horror of watching his mother turn. He didn't know how he could keep them both safe when the world had become this twisted, this terrifying. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the feverish look in Rachel's eyes. He heard her words echoing in his mind. "If I turn, promise me you'll protect Noah." But how could he protect her from herself? The hours dragged on, and as the fire flickered, Victor sat at the edge of their makeshift bed, watching Rachel sleep fitfully. She was restless, her breaths shallow, the fever taking hold of her more and more with each passing minute. Noah was asleep in the corner, his face pale, his little body curled up tightly. He didn't understand what was happening, not fully. To him, this was still just a bad dream, something that would go away if he just slept long enough. Victor wished with all his heart that it was that simple. By morning, Rachel's condition had worsened. The fever had spiked, and she was barely coherent, her words slurred. Her arm, where the scratch had once been just a small mark, was now swollen and discolored. She moaned in her sleep, her body shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Victor knew they didn't have much time. He had to make a choice: stay and risk everything for one more night of safety, or leave and keep running, hoping to get to the evacuation point in time. But how could he leave her, knowing what was coming? The decision was made for him when Rachel's eyes flickered open for a brief moment. Her gaze found his, and she managed a faint smile, though it was laced with sadness. "I'm sorry, Victor," she whispered. "I didn't want it to end like this." Victor's throat tightened, and he forced the words out. "I'll protect Noah. I'll make sure he's okay." Rachel nodded, the smile fading as her eyes slowly closed again, her body sinking deeper into the fever's grip. Victor sat there, his heart breaking in his chest, knowing that the promise he had made was about to be tested in ways he couldn't even imagine. And in that moment, the farmhouse didn't feel like refuge anymore. It felt like a trap. The tension in the farmhouse had reached a breaking point. Victor could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Rachel's condition had deteriorated faster than he had anticipated, the fever overtaking her body with a cruel, relentless pace. She barely recognized him anymore, and it was getting harder to hide the fear in his own heart, especially as Joel began to grow more and more suspicious. Joel had been kind to them at first, but as the days wore on, his patience wore thin. He didn't trust the infection to take its time, and he certainly didn't trust the chance that Rachel might turn before they could get out of there. He had been quiet about his concerns at first, but one evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, he finally spoke what had been hanging over them all. "She's a risk," Joel said, his voice low, more of an accusation than a statement. His big hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight. "I don't care if she's your wife. This isn't about that. If she turns, she's a liability. We can't afford to wait around for that to happen." Victor stood there, his back stiff with anger. "She's not a risk," he shot back, his voice edged with desperation. "She's my wife. She's not like them." Joel's eyes darkened. "I'm not asking you to make a choice between her and Noah, but if she goes, we can't let her bring us all down." Victor's chest tightened. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to face the reality that his family was falling apart, but the truth was undeniable. Before he could say anything, Hannah stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad's right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here. We need to leave before it's too late." The argument had barely begun when Rachel, from the next room, overheard their conversation. She had been lying in bed, barely conscious, but the mention of her name had stirred her. Her eyes opened, bloodshot and glazed, and she lifted her head, her voice a desperate rasp. "You can't," she said weakly, her hands trembling as she tried to sit up. "Victor, no, please, you have to leave." Victor rushed to her side, his heart breaking all over again. "Rachel, no, we'll figure this out. I won't let them do this." But she shook her head, her eyes wild with fear. "You don't understand," she gasped. "If they think I'm a risk, they'll kill me. They'll—" She trailed off, her breath catching in her throat. Victor's stomach twisted. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. But the desperation in her voice, the way her feverish eyes locked onto his, told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't just trying to protect herself. She was trying to protect Noah, trying to protect him from having to make the worst decision of his life. Before he could respond, there was a sudden crash from outside, an unmistakable sound of something large hitting the ground, followed by a guttural growl. The infected were close, too close. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she grabbed Victor's hand. "Go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising chaos. "You have to go now. You have to keep him safe." Victor's entire body went rigid as a wave of panic surged through him. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. But the roar of the infected, growing louder by the second, told him that it was already too late. Rachel pushed him away, her hands trembling but determined. "Go," she screamed, her voice filled with a raw urgency that sent a chill straight through Victor's bones. "Take Noah and run. I love you. I love you both." Tears streamed down Victor's face as he stumbled backward, barely able to comprehend what was happening. Rachel was already stumbling toward the window, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She was trying to buy them time, trying to give him and Noah a chance to escape. Victor grabbed Noah, who was frozen in place, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "We have to go, buddy. We have to go now." They bolted for the back door, the sounds of Rachel's screams and the infected pounding against the walls of the farmhouse echoing in Victor's ears. Every step felt like it tore a piece of him away, the weight of it all crushing him from the inside. As they ran into the night, the cries of Rachel, the woman he had promised to protect, the woman who had sacrificed herself for them, faded into the darkness. And with each passing second, Victor felt his heart shatter just a little bit more. They had run for miles, trying to escape the infected, but the forest had become their prison. Victor glanced around, looking for anything they could use, anything that could give them a chance. But the forest was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to close in on them. Noah was trembling beside him, his small body shaking with fear. Victor could see the fear in his son's eyes, a look that haunted him more than anything else. He had promised Rachel that he would protect him, but in this moment, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep that promise. They were trapped. The sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves snapped Victor back to reality. He looked up to see Mark, his face grim but determined, stepping in front of them. Mark had rejoined them earlier, offering them a sliver of hope, but now standing between Victor, Noah, and the advancing infected, he was their last line of defense. "I'll hold them off," Mark said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You two get to the tree line. Head east and don't look back." Victor opened his mouth to protest, but Mark cut him off with a hard look. "Go," he said again, more forcefully this time. "I'm not letting you die here." Before Victor could say anything more, Mark turned and faced the oncoming horde. His movements were swift and precise as he raised his pistol, firing into the crowd of infected. The shots rang out through the night like thunder, sending some of the creatures stumbling back. But there were too many. More and more of them flooded into the clearing, relentless and hungry. Victor tugged at Noah's arm, urging him toward the trees. "Come on, buddy, we have to move." Noah hesitated, his eyes glued to Mark, who was still firing. "What about him?" Noah whispered, his voice thick with fear. Victor's throat tightened. He didn't want to answer his son. He didn't want to tell him that Mark was buying them time, that Mark was sacrificing himself so they could live. But there was no time for anything else. He had to protect Noah. "Mark's a hero," Victor said, his voice breaking as he forced his feet to move. "We have to survive, Noah, for him." They moved quickly, the trees around them seeming to close in as they ran. Victor kept his eyes on the ground, afraid to look back, afraid to see Mark's final stand. but the sounds of gunfire and screams echoed through the forest, a chilling reminder of what they were leaving behind. Mark fought with everything he had, but it wasn't enough. The infected were too numerous, and despite his bravery, they overwhelmed him. Victor and Noah didn't know when it happened. When Mark had fallen, when his last breath had been taken, but the silence that followed told them all they needed to know. Victor kept running, his mind numb, his heart heavy with guilt and grief. He had lost too many people, Rachel, Mark, and now they were alone, again. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, they collapsed against a tree, both gasping for breath. Noah was crying now, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Victor pulled him close, holding him tightly, and trying to block out the nightmare that had been their lives for the past few days. "It's okay, Noah," Victor whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "We'll make it. I'll keep you safe." As they sat in the dark, the distant howls of the infected filled the air, a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Then, out of nowhere, a figure lunged at them from the shadows. Victor barely had time to react. The infected man, a grotesque, decaying figure with bloodshot eyes and a twisted expression, came at them with a speed that was unnatural for his condition. Noah cried out as the man's hand shot out, grabbing him by the shoulder and slamming him to the ground. Victor's heart lurched in his chest. "Noah!" he screamed, but the world seemed to slow down around him as he watched his son fall. The infected was on him in an instant. It wasn't like the movies or the stories. There was no grandiose struggle, no heroic last stand. It was raw, brutal, and terrifyingly fast. Noah's small body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his arms flailing as the infected man's teeth sank into his arm. Victor's heart stopped. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His son's screams pierced the air, and in the haze of panic, Victor didn't even notice the infected man's rancid breath as he pulled Noah closer, his teeth tearing into the boy's jacket and skin. "No!" Victor's voice cracked as he lunged forward, grabbing the infected by the shoulders and yanking him off Noah. He threw the man aside with all his strength, but the damage had been done. Blood poured from the deep bite marks on Noah's arm, staining his jacket and the dirt beneath him. "Noah!" Victor fell to his knees beside his son, shaking with fear. He cradled Noah's head in his lap, his hands pressing uselessly against the bloodied wound. "Noah, please, stay with me. We're going to get you help. I promise. Just hold on. We're going to get you to a doctor, a hospital, okay?" Noah's eyes were wide with shock, his face pale and strained with pain. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he didn't speak. His lips trembled, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Victor's hands shook as he tried to stop the bleeding, but there was no way to make it stop. He had seen the signs too many times. He knew what the bite meant. Victor's stomach twisted in knots as he tried to stay calm, tried to keep the panic from overwhelming him. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. "You're going to be okay." Noah's body shook with the effort of holding back tears, his small chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide with fear, and whispered, "Dad, I don't want to turn into one of them." The words cut through Victor like a knife. "I won't let that happen," Victor said, his voice hoarse. He held his son tighter, his eyes scanning the forest, but there was no help coming. There was no doctor, no hospital, just more infected, closing in from all sides. Victor's mind raced, his fists clenching as he whispered to himself, "I'm not leaving my son like this. There has to be a way to fix it, a cure, something. I left Rachel. I won't lose Noah too. I'll find a way, whatever it takes." Victor's hands trembled as he pressed his shirt against the wound, trying to stop the blood from flowing. The pressure made Noah wince, but he didn't complain. His small body was limp in Victor's arms as they walked through the deserted streets, every sound amplified in the silence that had taken over the city. The streets were a haunting reminder of how quickly everything had changed, and Victor's mind raced, trying to find any shred of hope. They reached the nearest hospital, but it was a nightmare. The doors were shattered, the waiting area abandoned. The bloodstains on the floor told the story of how quickly it had been overrun. Victor didn't waste any time. He pulled Noah along, his heart sinking deeper with each passing minute. They tried a few more hospitals, but each one told the same story. either overrun with infected or completely abandoned. In desperation, Victor turned down side streets, hoping for a miracle. Then, on the edge of town, they stumbled upon an old church. The wooden doors were cracked open, and a few survivors were scattered around, some lying in makeshift beds, others standing in line for treatment. It looked like a war zone. A nurse, her face pale and exhausted, glanced up at them as they approached. "We're sorry," she said, her voice strained. "There's nothing we can do. You need to keep moving." Victor's chest tightened with fear. "Please, he's been bitten. He needs help." The nurse shook her head. "There's nothing left here. Just keep going. You're not the only ones." Victor's heart sank, but he couldn't stop. They kept moving, trying clinic after clinic, but each one was either destroyed or far too dangerous to even approach. His hope was dwindling, and with every passing minute, Noah's condition worsened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Blood loss, fever, and that nagging fear that Noah might turn. That was the reality Victor was trying to outrun. Then, just when he thought they couldn't go any further, they came across an old, secluded medical facility on the outskirts of the city. It was tucked away, hidden behind overgrown vines and crumbling brick, but it seemed different. Victor's gut told him to give it one last try. Inside, the clinic was eerily quiet. A few survivors lingered in the waiting area, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. The air smelled sterile, but there was an underlying sense of hope, however faint. A woman in scrubs, Dr. Hargrove, greeted them. She was tired, but her eyes showed a determination Victor hadn't seen in days. "Let me take a look at him," Dr. Hargrove said, ushering them into a small examination room. Victor stood just outside the door, pacing, his mind racing. Every second felt like an eternity. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, Dr. Hargrove stepped out, her face unreadable. Victor's heart dropped. "How is he?" he demanded, trying to read her expression. Dr. Hargrove met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "He's been bitten, Victor, but he's not infected, he's not turning." Victor froze. His mind couldn't process what she was saying. "What do you mean? He was bitten, he's supposed to." His voice trailed off as he struggled to make sense of it. Victor and Noah stepped out of the medical facility, the weight of the world still heavy on their shoulders, but with a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. The streets were eerily quiet, the chaos of the world outside barely a whisper now in the background of their minds. Noah's hand tightened around Victor's, his small voice breaking the silence. "Will we be okay?" Victor paused for a moment, looking down at his son. The exhaustion in his bones was overwhelming, but he found the strength to smile, even if it was just for a second. "We will," he said, his voice firm, the tears in his eyes hidden by his resolve. "We have each other." Noah managed a weak smile, the slightest bit of relief in his expression. With one last look toward the uncertain world ahead of them, father and son began walking, their footsteps steady despite the unknowns. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Because no matter what this world had become, Victor knew one thing for sure. He would never give up on Noah, and that was enough to keep moving forward. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.